For a long time, the Second World War was told almost exclusively through the great battlefields of Europe, the Pacific and North Africa. But far from those spotlights, a silent war was unfolding in tropical waters, where few imagined the conflict could reach with such intensity. The South Atlantic, long seen as a safe rear area, was transformed into a deadly hunting ground. There, invisible beneath the ocean's surface, German submarines extended the reach of the Kriegsmarine into regions considered unlikely targets, and Brazil stood at the center of this new front of the war. At the beginning of the conflict, Brazil maintained an officially neutral position. However, its strategic location made the country a key piece on the global chessboard. Vital maritime routes passed along the Brazilian coast, linking the United States, Africa, and the Middle East. Oil, rubber, food, minerals, everything crossed that stretch of ocean. And where there are vital routes, there are targets. As the war progressed and Allied pressure tightened in the North Atlantic, German Submarine Command began expanding its operations into less protected areas. The objective was clear: disrupt Allied logistics, spread fear, and force the diversion of resources to defend regions previously considered safe. It was in this context that Type 9 submarines, designed for long-range ocean patrols, began appearing more frequently south of the equator. Among them was U-199. Commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Werner Krauss, U-199 set out on its South Atlantic patrol in mid-1943. Its mission was straightforward: attack Allied merchant ships, operate close to the Brazilian coast, and exploit any weakness in the region's air and naval defenses. By that point, Brazil had already been pushed into the war. After a series of brutal attacks on Brazilian merchant vessels in 1942, many resulting in heavy civilian casualties, neutrality became unsustainable. Public outrage demanded action. The government declared war on the Axis powers, and the Brazilian armed forces underwent a rapid transformation. Among those forces, the Brazilian Air Force began assuming a role few had imagined possible so soon: anti-submarine warfare. At first, resources were limited. Aircraft hastily adapted, crews trained under intense pressure, doctrine still taking shape. But there was one decisive factor: cooperation with the Allies and a clear sense of urgency. The skies over the Brazilian coastline began to be patrolled constantly. Long, exhausting flights, often monotonous, broken only by the silence of the sea and the constant tension of knowing that, at any moment, something could emerge from beneath the surface. U-199 operated cautiously, but also with confidence. Until then, German submarines had encountered little serious opposition in that region. The Brazilian coast offered tempting opportunities: heavy traffic, uneven defenses, and vast areas for evasion. But that perception was about to change. In July 1943, Brazilian aerial activity intensified significantly in the region around Rio de Janeiro. Reports of attacked ships, suspicious signals, and intelligence pointed to the presence of an enemy submarine operating dangerously close to the coast. The Atlantic was no longer distant and impersonal. The war was knocking at the door. On the morning of July 31, 1943, the fate of U-199 would begin to be sealed. The submarine's crew believed they were relatively safe. Operating close to the coast carried risks, but also advantages: less room for Allied maneuvering, greater difficulty in coordinating air and naval forces, and the possibility of quick attacks before disappearing once more beneath the waves. What Krauss and his crew did not know was that the balance had shifted. The Brazilian Air Force, now integrated into the Allied South Atlantic patrol system, was ready to prove that Brazil was no longer a weak link in the defensive chain. And when the first aircraft appeared on the horizon, it was already too late for U-199. The first visual contact happened almost abruptly. From above, the crew of the patrol aircraft spotted something that should not have been there: a dark silhouette cutting through the surface of the sea, far too close to the coast to be ignored. The metallic glint of the hull, still partially exposed, revealed what for months had been nothing more than a suspicion: a German submarine. In that instant there was no room for hesitation. The radio came alive, short and direct messages crossed the airwaves, and procedures rehearsed dozens of times finally left the paper to become reality. U-199 had been found. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere changed in seconds. Alarms sounded, orders were shouted in German, and the crew rushed to positions they knew by heart. Commander Krauss understood immediately what this meant. A submarine detected on the surface, especially during daylight, was at an extreme disadvantage. The priority was clear: dive as fast as possible. But time had become a luxury U-199 no longer possessed. As the submarine began its emergency maneuver, the Brazilian aircraft was already positioning itself for the attack. The pilot adjusted his approach, lining up with the target, while the observer maintained constant visual contact, guiding every correction with near-surgical precision. This was not an improvised attack. It was the direct result of months of accelerated learning, cooperation with Allied forces, and adaptation to a form of warfare entirely new to Brazil. The first depth charges were released. They did not need to hit the submarine directly. It was enough for them to explode close enough to generate shock waves capable of damaging the hull, disrupting internal systems, and forcing the enemy back to the surface, where it would be even more vulnerable. The explosions shook the sea. Columns of water erupted, the ocean boiled violently, and beneath the surface, U-199 felt the impact in brutal fashion. Instruments failed, lights flickered, and the hull groaned under the sudden pressure of the shock waves. Even so, the submarine tried to resist. Krauss ordered evasive maneuvers, attempting to gain depth and escape the attack cone. But space was limited. The proximity to the coast, which once seemed like an advantage, now became a trap. More aircraft were approaching. The Brazilian response was fast and coordinated. Aircraft from the Brazilian Air Force and the U.S. Navy converged on the area, forming an ever-tightening ring. The sky, once empty, began to fill with threats. U-199 was being hunted. Another sequence of attacks followed, each more precise than the last. The depth charges exploded closer and closer. The submarine lost partial control of its depth. Water began to seep into internal compartments. The situation was becoming critical. Then the inevitable happened. Unable to maintain its dive and suffering increasing damage, U-199 was forced to surface. When the hull broke the surface once more, there was no longer any illusion of escape. Aerial machine guns opened fire, striking the conning tower and exposed areas. The crew rushed onto the deck in desperation, trying to abandon the vessel while there was still a chance. The German submarine, which for weeks had operated as a silent predator, was now defenseless, immobilized, exposed to the sky. Shortly afterward, a final explosion sealed its fate. U-199 began to list rapidly. Within minutes, the submarine disappeared beneath the waves of the South Atlantic, taking part of its crew with it. Other men managed to throw themselves into the sea, clinging to debris, waiting for rescue that would come, ironically, from the very enemy that had just defeated them. Of the 49 crewmen aboard, 12 were killed. The survivors were captured and taken prisoner of war. But the impact of that episode went far beyond the number of dead or the sunken hull. That moment marked something historic. For the first time, the Brazilian Air Force had sunk an enemy submarine in real combat. Not as secondary support. Not as a supporting actor. But as a protagonist. The message was immediate and unmistakable. The South Atlantic was no longer free territory for U-boats. From that day on, the Kriegsmarine began to reassess its operations in the region. The risk had increased. The cost had become too high. What once seemed like a peripheral theater of war now proved to have eyes in the sky, coordination at sea, and political determination. For Brazil, the sinking of U-199 had a profound effect. Internally, it solidified the perception that the country was not merely a symbolic participant in the conflict, but an active and effective actor. Aircrews gained confidence. Anti-submarine doctrine matured. Integration with Allied forces deepened. Externally, the episode echoed as proof that the Axis could not operate with impunity in the South Atlantic. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that modern war did not depend solely on large fleets or imposing battleships. It depended on constant surveillance, rapid response, and integration between air, sea, and intelligence. U-199 was not just another lost submarine. It represented the end of an illusion. The illusion that there were safe seas. The illusion that certain regions were beyond the reach of war. The illusion that peripheral nations would play no decisive role in global conflicts. In the silence that followed the sinking, the South Atlantic remained the same vast, deep ocean it had always been. But the war there had changed forever. And Brazil was no longer just a spectator. The sinking of U-199, however, cannot be understood as an isolated event. It was the direct result of a quiet transformation that had been unfolding for months, both in Brazil and across the South Atlantic itself. Before that August of 1943, German submarines had operated with relative freedom in the region. Brazil's long coastline, poorly protected in the early years of the war, had become a strategic corridor for U-boats. Merchant ships were sunk just a few miles from shore. Civilian crews died without ever seeing the enemy. A constant sense of vulnerability took hold. That reality is what pushed Brazil decisively into the conflict. The attacks on Brazilian ships in 1942 were not merely military incidents, they were political and emotional shocks. They struck public opinion directly, shattered any remaining neutrality, and accelerated a process already underway, the urgent modernization of the armed forces, especially aviation and anti-submarine warfare. The Brazilian Air Force, still a young institution, went through a brutal learning curve. Aircrews were trained at speed. Doctrines had to be absorbed almost in real time. Maritime patrol techniques, target identification, depth charge attacks, and coordination with Allied naval forces became routine. None of this was trivial. Flying long hours over the ocean, often without visual contact with land, demanded discipline, precise navigation, and physical and psychological endurance. Detecting a submarine, sometimes only by a wake on the water or a fleeting reflection, required constant attention. Attacking at the right moment from the correct angle with proper timing and distance calculations was a skill developed only through training and experience. U-199 was caught precisely within this new reality. It did not face an undefended coastline. It did not encounter an improvised enemy. It met a system that was finally beginning to function. And that had wider consequences. After the loss of U-199, German commanders began to treat the Brazilian coast with increasing caution. Aerial patrols became more frequent. Cooperation with the United States intensified coverage of the South Atlantic. The risk of detection grew with each passing day. For a submarine, risk is everything. Unlike surface ships, a U-boat lives by invisibility. Once that advantage is lost, it ceases to be a predator and becomes prey. That is exactly what began to happen in the region. Submarine warfare, designed to strangle vital maritime routes, started to incur an operational cost that was simply too high. Each mission became more dangerous. Every approach to the coast grew riskier. Every surfacing turned into a gamble against chance. The South Atlantic was no longer permissive space. For Brazil, the episode also carried deep symbolic weight. The sinking of U-199 helped solidify an operational identity. The Brazilian Air Force was no longer merely a force in formation, but an organization capable of executing complex, integrated, and lethal missions. That experience would shape its doctrine for decades. More than that, it changed international perceptions. Brazil came to be seen as a reliable partner in the defense of the South Atlantic. Its air bases became key nodes in the Allied patrol network. Its aviation earned respect. Its strategic role was no longer peripheral. And all of this began with encounters like that one, an aircraft in the sky, a submarine at sea, and decisions made in seconds that carried global consequences. For the survivors of U-199, captured and taken as prisoners of war, there remained the bitter irony of having been defeated far from the great theaters of battle that dominated the strategic maps of the time. They had been sent to a region considered secondary. They discovered, too late, that a real, modern, and unforgiving war was being fought there as well. Today, decades later, the site where U-199 sank lies silent on the ocean floor. The sea has closed over the wreckage as it always does. But the story was not lost. It remains a powerful reminder that wars are not decided only in major confrontations, that distant seas matter, and that sometimes a single visual contact on the horizon is enough to change the course of an entire campaign. And that morning in August 1943 was exactly that. From that point on, the story of U-199 came to occupy a specific place in the memory of the war in the South Atlantic, not merely as another lost submarine but as a turning point. It symbolizes the moment when the logic of the hunt definitively shifted sides in that region. Until then, the submarine had been the invisible hunter. It operated at a distance, chose when to attack, when to withdraw, and when to disappear. The surface was dangerous but necessary. Submergence offered protection but also isolation. The balance was always delicate. What changed in 1943 was that this balance began to collapse. Maritime patrol aviation drastically reduced the safe time U-boats could spend on the surface. And without time on the surface, there was no way to recharge batteries, ventilate the interior of the hull, or maintain strategic mobility. Submarines of that era still depended heavily on air and fuel. They were not truly fully submerged weapons, they were surface ships that could dive. That technical detail, often overlooked, proved fatal. Each new aerial patrol shortened the margin for error even further. A commander had to choose, surface and risk being spotted, or remain submerged and lose mobility. Neither option was good. Both led, sooner or later, to defeat. U-199 was caught precisely in this dilemma. Later reports indicate that the submarine was already under pressure before the final attack. Constant aerial presence, difficulty approaching targets, and increased surveillance made every maneuver more tense. When it was detected, reaction time was minimal. There was no room for error. No space for complex maneuvers. Modern war does not forgive hesitation. From the Brazilian perspective, the episode also revealed something fundamental: the importance of integration. None of the forces involved would have achieved that result alone. Aerial detection, coordinated attack, coverage, and rapid response were all parts of a system that was beginning to mature. It was networked warfare, still in its early stages. That lesson was not lost after the war. It shaped doctrine, influenced investments, and helped define Brazil's strategic role in the post-war world. The defense of the South Atlantic ceased to be merely a circumstantial concern and came to be understood as a permanent responsibility. Decades later, that legacy still echoes. U-199 today is more than wreckage on the ocean floor. It is a historical reference point. A reminder that technology, training, and coordination can completely transform the balance of power, even far from the great stages of war. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of this story. War is not decided solely by who possesses the most feared weapon, but by who can adapt more quickly to changes on the battlefield. The submarine, which had dominated the early phase of the conflict, became vulnerable the moment it lost its primary advantage: invisibility. In the deep silence of the ocean where U-199 now rests, there is neither glory nor defeat, only the concrete proof that no weapon is invincible forever. And that, in August 1943, the South Atlantic ceased to be free territory for the invisible hunters. As the days passed, the impact of that sinking began to spread beyond military circles. The news moved through bases, commands, and government offices, making it clear that something had changed definitively. For the first time, the South Atlantic ceased to be seen merely as a distant rear area of the European conflict and came to be recognized as an active theater, where decisions and actions carried real weight in the outcome of the war. For Germany, the loss of U-199 was not just another number added to the growing statistics of destroyed submarines. It represented confirmation that the strategy of extending operations into regions considered secondary no longer offered the expected safety. The ocean was becoming far too small for the secrecy that U-boats required to survive. German commanders knew this. Internal reports already indicated that the loss rate had become unsustainable. Each new patrol cost more men, more material, and delivered fewer results. The initial advantage, based on surprise and the scarcity of Allied anti-submarine assets, had vanished. In its place emerged an environment saturated with sensors, aircraft, escorts, and increasingly refined procedures. U-199 fell victim to this new reality. Unlike the early years of the war when submarines could operate for weeks without encountering enemy forces, every mile sailed now carried risk. Every radio transmission could be intercepted. Every surfacing might be the last. The ocean no longer concealed, it exposed. In Brazil, the episode accelerated a shift in mindset that was already underway. The war ceased to be something distant, observed through telegrams and maps. It became something felt in the air, at sea, and in the direct responsibility of protecting routes vital to the Allied war effort. The South Atlantic was a strategic artery. Through it passed ships carrying oil, raw materials, food, and equipment. If that artery were cut, the impact would be immediate. The sinking of U-199 showed that defense was possible, but that it required constant vigilance. And vigilance has a cost. More aircraft were assigned. More crews were trained. More flight hours accumulated. Greater coordination between forces was demanded. The effort was continuous and exhausting, but the alternative was unthinkable. War allowed no pauses. At the same time, the episode had a profound symbolic effect. For many Brazilian servicemen, it was the first concrete confirmation that they were, in fact, engaged in direct combat against one of the most feared weapons of the conflict. This changed how training was approached, how missions were planned, and how risk was perceived. These were no longer routine patrols. Each flight now carried the real expectation of confrontation. Every dark shape on the sea could conceal a deadly enemy. This awareness raised levels of attention and professionalism at an accelerated pace, shaped not by theory but by experience. The silence surrounding the fate of U-199 also carried a human weight that is hard to ignore. Inside that hull, men died without witnesses, far from home, in a war that offered no space for rescue or surrender. The ocean swallowed not only a submarine, but individual stories that would never be told. This is an aspect of submarine warfare that is often forgotten. There are no visible clashes. No clearly defined battlefields. There is only the sudden impact, the explosion, the water rushing in, and the end. For those inside, everything happens in seconds. For those who learn of it later, all that remains is the dry record of a sinking. And yet, the strategic meaning endures. U-199 marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. From that point on, the submarine ceased to be the absolute predator in the South Atlantic. It became the object of systematic, persistent, and increasingly effective hunting. War had learned how to fight it. And when war learns, it rarely forgets. In the months that followed, the pattern would repeat itself. Submarines would withdraw. Routes would be reinforced. Initiative would change hands. The ocean, which once favored the invisible, would come to favor those who could see first. In the end, the story of U-199 is not just about a sunken submarine. It is about the precise moment when the balance of submarine warfare finally tipped, even in waters that, not long before, had seemed safe for those who lived in the shadows. As the conflict progressed and this new balance became firmly established, the episode of U-199 came to be seen not merely as an isolated success, but as a clear sign of operational maturity. The war in the South Atlantic had entered a new phase, less improvised, more systematic, and far more lethal for those who still believed those waters were a safe refuge. The Germans understood the message quickly. Maintaining submarine operations in that region began to demand ever greater resources for increasingly diminishing returns. The risk no longer justified the effort. Each mission required crossing monitored areas, surviving constant aerial patrols, and operating under the permanent pressure of being detected at any moment. At that stage, the psychological burden became as heavy as the physical danger. For a submarine, knowing that the enemy controls the air changes everything. German doctrine had always relied on stealth, surprise attacks, and freedom of maneuver across vast ocean spaces. As those spaces began to shrink, the very essence of the submarine as a weapon was eroded. U-199 did not fall because of a single mistake or extraordinary bad luck. It was lost because the strategic environment no longer favored its existence. On the Allied side, especially in Brazil, the effect was the opposite. Success reinforced confidence in a defensive model built on cooperation, technology, and persistence. There was no single decisive blow, but rather an accumulation of continuous actions. Flying, observing, recording, and flying again. Day after day. Hour after hour. Anti-submarine warfare is, above all, a war of endurance. It demands more patience than heroics, more method than impulse. The sinking of U-199 demonstrated that this approach worked, that fatigue, repetition, and constant vigilance were weapons just as effective as bombs and machine guns. Over time, the episode also gained broader historical significance. It came to symbolize the moment when Brazil definitively moved beyond the role of an armed observer and assumed, in practice, the role of an active combatant in a global conflict. Not merely escorting, not merely patrolling, but directly confronting the enemy. This transition had lasting consequences. The experience accumulated in the South Atlantic would shape doctrine, force organization, and strategic thinking in the post-war years. The understanding that national maritime and airspace had to be protected in an integrated manner did not disappear with the end of the war. On the contrary, it became a permanent element of military planning. The sea was no longer seen as a natural barrier. It was a space to be controlled. And controlling the sea required something deeper than ships and aircraft. It required coordination, intelligence, logistics, and above all, continuity. The war taught that reacting was not enough. It was necessary to anticipate. In this sense, U-199 became a silent milestone. A turning point that rarely appears in major global history books, yet carries enormous weight when viewed on a regional and strategic scale. It represents the moment when submarine warfare lost the element of surprise in a part of the world where it had once felt secure. It also represents the moment when a force still in the process of consolidation proved that it could learn quickly, adapt, and prevail. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this episode. It was not technology alone that sank U-199. It was not just the bomb, the aircraft, or the patrol. It was the realization that the war had changed, and that those who failed to keep pace with that change would be swallowed by the sea, without warning and without return. Thus, in the silence of the South Atlantic waters, a message was etched that would echo until the end of the conflict. The era of the solitary submarine was coming to an end. The story, however, does not end at the moment of the sinking. As with many episodes of the war, its deepest consequences only became clear with the passage of time. For the Kriegsmarine, the loss of U-199 was another data point in an equation that was becoming impossible to ignore. From 1943 onward, German submarines were no longer free hunters. They had become potential prey, forced to operate under constant aerial threat, along predictable routes with ever-shrinking margins for error. The South Atlantic, once seemingly far removed from the center of the conflict, was now definitively part of the map of Germany's submarine defeat. Statistics confirmed this perception. The number of Allied ships sunk was declining, while U-boat losses were rising at an alarming rate. Each mission required more fuel, more planning, and greater risk, all for increasingly modest results. The strategic balance had reversed. For Brazil, the effect was almost the opposite. The sinking of U-199 reinforced the conviction that the effort was worthwhile. The long flight hours, the strain on air crews, the accelerated adaptation to foreign doctrines, and the integration of still new technologies had produced a concrete result. The enemy could be found. It could be tracked. And it could be destroyed. This had a direct impact on morale. Crews began to approach missions with a different mindset. These were no longer abstract patrols over a vast ocean, but operations with a clear purpose. Every flight mattered. Every sighting could be decisive. The idea that something might happen today ceased to be a hope and became a real expectation. This psychological factor is often underestimated, but in long wars it is decisive. Anti-submarine warfare offers few immediate, visible rewards. There are no clearly defined front lines, no spectacular victories. There is only constant vigilance, exhausting repetition, and long periods without contact. When contact finally occurs, everything is decided in minutes or seconds. U-199 proved that those minutes could change everything. At the institutional level, the episode accelerated processes already underway. Integration between the Navy and the Air Force came to be treated not as an exception, but as the norm. Information sharing was prioritized. Procedures were refined. Communication protocols were simplified to reduce critical delays. The logic was simple. The less time between detection and attack, the greater the chance of success. This mindset would survive the end of the war. In the post-war period, Brazil carried with it the practical experience of having defended a vital maritime space against a modern and sophisticated threat. This would influence everything from officer training to how the country viewed its strategic role in the South Atlantic. The ocean ceased to be merely a commercial route. It became an area of responsibility. And that responsibility came at a cost. The sinking of U-199 also revealed something important about the nature of modern warfare: the asymmetry between effort and outcome. For the Allies, maintaining constant aerial patrols required logistics, fuel, maintenance, and personnel. For German submarines, a single mistake, a spotted periscope, a poorly concealed wake, a moment of inattention, could bring everything to an end. Over time, this asymmetry became unsustainable for those on the defensive. The submarine, which had begun the war as the weapon of the weak against the strong, was now facing a system that learned quickly, adapted effectively, and exacted an ever higher price for every incursion. And U-199 was swallowed by that very system. Today, when looking back at this episode, it may seem small compared to the great battles of the North Atlantic or the massive confrontations in the Pacific. But on a strategic scale, it represents something larger: the definitive closing of a gap. A space that once allowed infiltration was denied. An ocean once permissive became hostile. An invisible enemy became hunted. At its core, U-199 was not just a submarine sunk. It was proof that the war had reached the South Atlantic, and that, by then, it was already beginning to change its victor. And when the conflict finally ended, the silence that settled over those waters would not be the same silence as before. It would be a watched silence. Over the following months, the episode of U-199 began to acquire a symbolic weight that went far beyond its immediate military value. It came to be cited in reports, internal studies, and later in historical analyses as a quiet milestone in the maturation of anti-submarine defense in the South Atlantic. Until then, there had been a diffuse sense of improvisation. Patrols existed, agreements were in place, but everything still felt experimental, as if the South Atlantic theater were merely a distant appendix of the main war. The sinking of U-199 changed that perception. It demonstrated that this was no longer a matter of deterrent presence, but of real combat, and successful combat. This had practical consequences. From that point on, Allied commanders began to seriously consider the South Atlantic as a denied area for German submarines. Not completely safe, but increasingly hostile. The mere fact that a U-boat had been located, pursued, and destroyed so close to the Brazilian coast served as a warning to any other crew considering operations in the region. For German submariners, this created a cruel dilemma. Avoiding the South Atlantic further reduced the available operational areas, concentrating U-boats in zones already saturated with escorts, aircraft, and sensors. Insisting on operating there, on the other hand, exponentially increased the risk of detection. An ocean that had once offered strategic depth now functioned as a trap. This kind of dilemma does not appear on maps, but it decides wars. Another aspect, less discussed but fundamental, was the technical impact of the episode. Every encounter with a submarine generated data. Maneuvering patterns, submergence times, reactions to aerial attack, behavior under depth charge assault. U-199, even in sinking, continued to teach. Reports detailed how the submarine attempted to escape, how long it remained submerged, when it was forced to surface, and how it reacted to the final attack. This information fed into almost immediate tactical adjustments. Attack altitudes, approach angles, spacing between depth charges, everything could be refined. Anti-submarine warfare was, above all, a war of continuous learning. And in that process those who learned faster survived. Brazil, which had entered the conflict relatively late, ended up absorbing in just a few years an experience that had taken other nations decades to build. This shaped an entire generation of aviators and sailors, who came to see the sea not merely as a space of transit, but as a complex, dynamic, and potentially lethal operational environment. This legacy did not disappear with the end of the war. In the post-war period, many of the procedures developed during those patrols continued to be taught, adapted, and incorporated into doctrine. The idea of permanent vigilance, of integration between different means, and of rapid response to invisible threats remained valid, even when the enemy changed flags. Today, when revisiting the story of U-199, it is tempting to see it merely as an isolated episode. A submarine sunk, a successful engagement, a footnote in the vast chronology of the Second World War. But that reading misses what truly matters. U-199 represents the moment when the South Atlantic ceased to be a periphery and became a frontier. A frontier watched over by aircraft, ships, and men who, not long before, had never imagined they would be part of a global war. It also represents the definitive transition of the submarine from solitary predator to target of an integrated system. A system that combined eyes in the sky, weapons at sea, and information flowing in near real time. And, perhaps most importantly, it stands as proof that in modern wars, victory rarely comes from a single spectacular blow. It is born of persistence, of vigilance, of the ability to turn routine into advantage. U-199 sank in a matter of minutes. But the meaning of its loss continues to echo far beyond that point in the ocean. Because from that moment on, the South Atlantic would never again be an empty space. Even after the end of the war, the case of U-199 continued to be studied with almost obsessive attention. Not out of nostalgia, nor for propaganda, but because it condensed, in just a few minutes, everything that naval warfare had become. Speed, integration, and irreversibility. For the Germans, the episode was a clear sign of strategic exhaustion. It was no longer merely a matter of numerical losses, but of losing the initiative itself. The U-boat, which at the beginning of the war operated with near absolute freedom, was now forced to react, to flee, to improvise. And every reaction increased its exposure. Submarines that needed to surface to recharge batteries became targets. Submarines that remained submerged for too long lost mobility, situational awareness, and room to maneuver. The ocean, which once concealed, now revealed. In the South Atlantic, this became particularly evident. Geography did not favor the Germans. Commercial routes were predictable, Allied ports were well distributed, and aerial patrol areas could be covered with growing efficiency. Unlike the North Atlantic, where weather and sheer vastness still offered some protection, the southern waters were clearer, more open, more controllable. Each patrol flight, even without contact, tightened the net. And each successful engagement, like that of U-199, reinforced confidence in the system as a whole. Crews gained assurance. Commanders trusted reports more readily. Decisions were made with less hesitation. This also changed the behavior of convoys. Merchant ships, once dispersed and vulnerable, began operating with greater discipline. Routes were adjusted, schedules synchronized, communications standardized. The simple awareness that there were eyes in the sky reduced panic and increased cohesion. The invisible war was beginning to produce visible effects. Another crucial point was international cooperation. The sinking of U-199 was not solely a Brazilian achievement, but the result of a larger mechanism. Shared intelligence, common doctrines, standardized equipment. None of it would have worked in isolation. The episode demonstrated unequivocally that operational sovereignty at sea no longer depended solely on the flag painted on a hull, but on the ability to integrate into a larger network. This was a lesson that survived the post-war period intact. Decades later, when the submarine threat took on new forms, quieter, deeper, more technological, the fundamental principles remained the same. Detect early. React quickly. Do not allow the enemy space to breathe. U-199 belongs to a specific era, but the logic of its destruction has not aged. It repeats itself in modern exercises, in digital simulations, in patrols that now use sensors its crew could never have imagined. The setting has changed. The essence has not. And perhaps that is the most powerful point of this story. It is not merely about a submarine sunk near the Brazilian coast. It is about the moment when submarine warfare lost its mystery. When the invisible became traceable. When the ocean ceased to be a refuge and became a field of surveillance. U-199 was not the largest submarine. It was not the deadliest. It was not the most famous. But it was one of those that best symbolized the end of an era. An era in which silence was protection. And in which, for a few years, that was enough. After it, it never would be again. The repercussions of the sinking of U-199 also had a profound effect within the Brazilian Air Force itself. Up to that point, maritime patrol aviation was still seen by some sectors as a complement, important but secondary, to naval operations. After that episode, this perception changed permanently. It became clear that the aircraft was not merely an observer of the sea. It had become a complete anti-submarine weapon. From then on, training efforts intensified. Crews began to repeat search, identification, and attack procedures exhaustively. The time between sighting and action had to be minimal. There was no room for hesitation. A detected submarine was a submarine that had to be attacked immediately, because every additional second meant a chance for it to dive and disappear. This sense of urgency was born directly from experiences like that of U-199. Pilots learned to recognize almost imperceptible patterns on the ocean's surface. A strange reflection. A line that did not follow the movement of the waves. A shadow moving against the logic of the current. None of this came from manuals, it came from practice. And the more they flew, the more the ocean seemed to speak. On the German side, the impact was silent but deep. Each loss in the South Atlantic carried a disproportionate strategic weight. It was not just one less submarine. It was a trained crew, an experienced commander, weeks or months of patrol wasted. And worse still, it was confirmation that even areas considered secondary were no longer safe. The concept of quiet zones simply ceased to exist. This forced desperate tactical changes. U-boats began to remain submerged for longer periods, even when this drastically reduced their mobility. Emergencies were postponed. Risks accumulated. The submarine, designed to be a predator, was becoming a cornered animal. And a cornered predator makes mistakes. U-199 was not the only example, but it was one of the most instructive. Its attempt to escape toward deeper waters, its prolonged exposure on the surface, the rapid aerial response. All of this revealed how dangerously compressed the German decision cycle had become. The margin for improvisation was gone. Another often overlooked aspect is the psychological effect of this type of operation. For Allied crews, each success reinforced the belief that the submarine was not invincible. For German submariners, each report of a successful aerial patrol fed the opposite feeling, that the sea no longer offered refuge. Letters sent back to Germany, internal reports, and war records show a clear increase in emotional strain. The fear did not come only from the attack itself, but from constant surveillance. From the feeling of being watched even when nothing seemed to be happening. This is a form of pressure that leaves no visible marks on the hull, but exacts a heavy toll. As the months passed, the South Atlantic ceased to be an active front for U-boats. Not because the Germans voluntarily withdrew, but because the cost became too high to justify the results. Efforts were redirected, priorities changed, and submarine warfare entered its defensive phase. In this context, Brazil consolidated a role that is rarely fully recognized, that of guardian of one of the most vital routes of the conflict. Without great naval battles, without dueling battleships, without epic imagery, but with constant vigilance, international coordination, and decisive action at the right moment. U-199 represents exactly that. Not a grand confrontation, but a victory built on attention, discipline, and integration. A victory that did not happen by chance. And one that helped ensure that millions of tons of supplies crossed the Atlantic safely. In the end, this may be the greatest lesson of this story. Modern war is not won only by the largest ships, the most powerful weapons, or the most dramatic gestures. It is won by systems that work every day even when no one is watching. And in that August of 1943, over the waters off the Brazilian coast, that system worked. Even after the sinking of U-199, the echoes of that episode continued to spread throughout the entire Allied defense structure in the South Atlantic. Reports circulated among naval, air, and even diplomatic commands, not as propaganda, but as concrete evidence that the nature of the war in that region had changed. The South Atlantic was no longer a marginal space. It had become a protected strategic corridor. From that moment on, coordination among Brazil, the United States, and the United Kingdom deepened even further. Intelligence information began to circulate more rapidly. Sightings reports, suspicious radio signals, and navigation patterns were analyzed in an integrated manner. The ocean ceased to be merely vast, it became monitored. And that changed everything. The mere possibility of constant aerial surveillance forced enemy submarines to operate under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Remaining submerged for long periods meant reduced speed, shorter range, and extreme crew fatigue. Surfacing to recharge batteries became an agonizing decision, always taken with the risk that it might be the last. The sea was no longer an ally. It had become a hostile space. For Brazil, this period marked a definitive transformation in strategic mindset. The war demonstrated unequivocally that territorial defense did not end at the coastline. It extended thousands of kilometers into the ocean, along commercial routes, across points that seemed invisible on the map. Each aircraft on patrol was not merely searching for submarines. It was protecting economies, logistical chains, and human lives far beyond the horizon. This lesson would shape Brazilian military thinking in the post-war period. The concept of permanent maritime surveillance, force integration, and the use of aviation as a strategic tool would cease to be an exception and become doctrine. The sinking of U-199 in this sense was more than a tactical success. It was a conceptual milestone. From a historical perspective, it also helps dismantle a persistent myth that submarine warfare was fought only in the great arenas of the North Atlantic, among massive convoys and colossal fleets. The reality was far more distributed, quieter, and often more decisive in regions considered peripheral. Without control of the South Atlantic, the Allied war effort would have been severely compromised. And the Germans knew this. That is why U-199 was there. And that is why its loss was so significant. Today, looking back on this episode with the distance of time, it reveals something even deeper. How modern wars are won not only through spectacular confrontations, but through the accumulation of precise, repeated, and coordinated actions, many of them far from the spotlight. An aircraft that takes off. A crew that observes. A commander who decides to strike at the right moment. Individually, these elements seem small. Together, they change the course of history. And so, the story of U-199 does not end at the bottom of the ocean. It continues as part of a broader transformation, that of a country which, amid the greatest war of the 20th century, quietly assumed the responsibility of protecting an entire ocean. An invisible war. But an absolutely decisive one. As the months passed, the lesson left by U-199 began to influence decisions that went far beyond a single sinking. The South Atlantic was gradually redrawn, not on public maps, but within the internal planning of Allied forces. Routes were adjusted, escort patterns modified, and areas once considered safe began to be treated with caution. For German submarine commanders, the region started to acquire a grim reputation. Accounts from surviving crews described an increasingly unpredictable environment. Aircraft appeared where none had before. Patrols emerged at irregular times. Merchant ships that seemed like easy targets were often accompanied by discreet escorts or operated under invisible air cover. The feeling was unmistakable. Someone was watching. This had a profound psychological effect. Submarines are weapons of patience, silence, and cold calculation. When uncertainty becomes constant, when every surfacing may be the last, mental strain accumulates quickly. Operational efficiency declines. Mistakes begin to appear. Hesitation replaces the aggressiveness that had once defined German submarine warfare. And all of this without major battles. Without announcements. Without headlines. On the Brazilian side, the effect was the opposite. Each successful mission reinforced crew confidence. Pilots, observers, and ground support teams began to see their routines no longer as extended exercises, but as real combat operations, because they were. The ocean ceased to be merely a space to patrol and became an active operational environment, where every detail mattered. the correct identification of a wake, the interpretation of a stain on the water, the discipline to maintain radio silence, the coordination between aircraft and ships. These elements, refined day after day, transformed Brazilian operational capability into something far more sophisticated than what existed at the beginning of the war. It is important to understand that none of this happened instantly or through improvisation. There were mistakes. There were false alarms. There were exhausting missions that ended without any contact at all. But in anti-submarine warfare, this was part of the process. Simply being present was already a way of denying space to the enemy. Each patrol forced the submarine to change course. Each course change reduced its effectiveness. Each reduction in effectiveness brought it closer to failure. This is a kind of war not measured solely in ships sunk, but in opportunities denied. Over time, the Germans themselves began to reassess their expectations for the South Atlantic. The region ceased to be seen as a promising secondary theater, and came to be regarded as a high-risk area with diminishing returns. More modern submarines were required. More experienced crews were demanded. Even so, the chances of success continued to fall. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The Allied war effort grew on an industrial scale. More aircraft, more radar, more sonar, more ships. The asymmetry widened with each passing month. U-199 was not an isolated point, it was a symptom of an irreversible trend. When the war finally drew near its end, it was clear that the South Atlantic had fulfilled its silent role. Routes remained open. The flow of resources continued without decisive interruption. Allied economies endured. And this did not happen by chance. Victory there had no single date. No final battle. No spectacular surrender at sea. It was built day after day, flight after flight, patrol after patrol. And at the center of this story remains the image of a German submarine that believed it was operating far from danger, until it discovered that danger had learned to fly. The story of U-199 therefore is not only about a sinking. It is about the moment when the South Atlantic ceased to be a strategic void and became a defended space. A watched ocean. An invisible war. And a victory built in silence. When looking at the conclusion of this story, it becomes clear that the sinking of U-199 was not merely an isolated episode of the Second World War. It represented something greater, deeper, and in many ways definitive. The consolidation of a new balance in the South Atlantic. For Germany, the episode symbolized the end of an illusion. The belief that regions far from the main European theaters would remain vulnerable, poorly defended, and open to U-boat operations proved unsustainable. The ocean had shrunk. The war had become truly global, and there were no longer any forgotten zones. Each submarine lost far from Europe was harder to replace. Each experienced crew that failed to return represented a silent but profound blow to German operational capacity. U-199 was only one among many, but its loss sent a clear message. The margin for maneuver was disappearing. From the Brazilian perspective, the impact was long-lasting. Active participation in anti-submarine warfare not only strengthened the country's strategic position within the Allied context, but also accelerated a process of military and doctrinal maturation. The Brazilian Air Force, still young at the time, emerged from the war with real combat experience, integrated operations with naval forces, and mastery of complex missions in a maritime environment. These lessons did not vanish with the end of the conflict. They influenced future generations, shaped institutional structures, justified investments, and helped define Brazil's role in the security of the South Atlantic in the decades that followed. Maritime surveillance, international cooperation, and regional strategic awareness became permanent elements of military thinking. There is also a human dimension that cannot be ignored. For the crew of U-199, the mission ended abruptly and violently, far from home, in waters many had never imagined as a combat zone. For the Brazilian aviators, that encounter marked the definitive transition from training to real war, a moment that would shape their lives forever. At this point, war reveals its starkest face. Decisions made in seconds, consequences that echo for decades. When the weapons finally fell silent, the South Atlantic was no longer the same. It had been integrated into the global defense system, recognized as vital to the flow of resources, people, and decisions that shaped the outcome of the conflict. Its strategic importance was firmly established. And all of this without massive fleets clashing. Without monumental battles immortalized in famous paintings. Without grand speeches. Victory there was built in the details. In constant patrols. In discipline. In adaptation. It was a war of shadows, fought against an enemy that depended on silence, and was ultimately defeated by watchful eyes in the sky. Thus, as this narrative comes to a close, what remains is not merely the story of a sunken submarine, but the portrait of a transformation. The moment when submarine warfare began to lose its mystery. The instant when the South Atlantic ceased to be just a space between continents and became a decisive field of history. An ocean that, for a long time, seemed distant from the war. Until the war reached it. And stayed.